Have you ever laughed, truly laughed, only to realize, too late, that the moment wasn't funny at all? Sometimes, the quietest person in the room sees what no one else does. Sometimes, we all laugh at the wrong thing, and someone else carries the weight of our mistake. This story starts with an open mic, a birthday crowd, and a little boy who doesn't speak. It ends with a single sentence, 6 words, that silences a roomful of laughter. If you believe that strength doesn't always shout, and that compassion doesn't always look heroic, hit like and subscribe to. Stay with us till the end, because today's story might change the way you see who really matters in a room. The restaurant shimmered with warm lights and glittering decorations, each table dressed in white linen and gold accents for the extravagant birthday celebration of the Aldridge family, one of the wealthiest names in the city. It was the kind of evening where laughter echoed too loud, champagne glasses never ran dry, and every child wore something pressed and expensive. In the far corner of the room, tucked near a window slightly veiled with velvet drapes, sat a boy who didn't quite belong. 10-year-old Evan Willis, dressed in a soft blue shirt and gray slacks, sat rigid in his seat. His fingers picked lightly at the seams of his sleeves. His eyes, bright and searching, flicked between the flickering candles and the swirling colors of balloons floating above. He hadn't touched his food. He hadn't spoken a word. Evan was Grant Willis's son. And Grant Willis, business tycoon, philanthropist, and perennial face of luxury magazines, stood on the opposite side of the room, deep in conversation with a state senator. His laughter boomed like someone used to being heard. His son, however, was a boy used to being overlooked. Evan had autism. Crowds overwhelmed him. Noise disoriented him. Sudden attention made his chest tighten. But no one at the party seemed to notice. At least, no one except the waitress, Josie. Josie had been watching from a distance. In her crisp black uniform, balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres and sparkling cider, she had noticed the boy's silence in a room full of chaos. While others leaned over Evan, waving toys or pushing plates toward him, she was the only one who crouched at his eye level, whispering gently, never asking him to speak. Josie had studied speech-language therapy in college before life redirected her to this job. She hadn't forgotten what it meant to really see a child. The evening's entertainment, meant to be charming and light-hearted, was an open mic for the kids, an invitation for the young guests to come up and share a joke, a song, or even a funny dance. One by one, the children made their way to the microphone. Some sang. Some stammered. Some danced awkwardly to canned music. The room clapped, cheered, and tossed napkins like confetti. Then it happened. A group of older children, 3 boys in matching navy blazers and slicked-back hair, whispered among themselves, eyes darting toward Evan. One of them grinned. Another reached for Evan's arm. "Come on, buddy," he said, loud enough for nearby adults to hear. "You haven't had your turn yet." Before Evan could react, they were pulling him up, one hand gripping his wrist, another patting his back like this was all in good fun. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. His eyes darted quickly toward the corner, looking for Josie, but she was across the room with a tray in hand. The boys led him to the stage. There was a brief chuckle from the crowd. Then the music started. It was a cartoonish track, bouncing with silly sound effects and exaggerated beats, a song meant for slapstick. The boys handed Evan the microphone, which trembled slightly in his grasp. He stood frozen under the spotlight, the warmth from the beam hitting his skin like fire. The room burst into laughter at the image, the awkward silent boy, standing center stage, blank as a statue. A woman at a nearby table giggled into her wine glass. A man snorted. Even some of the waitstaff smiled nervously, unsure if this was cruel or cute. Evan's fingers curled tightly around the mic. His chest rose and fell. His lower lip trembled. But he didn't move. From the back of the room, Josie stopped walking. She didn't shout. She didn't drop the tray. She just froze. Her eyes locked on the boy standing alone under the light, too small for the moment, too exposed for what he carried inside. The laughter grew. One of the older boys whispered something from the edge of the stage, earning a few more chuckles. But Evan didn't turn. He didn't speak. His shoulders hunched slightly, and his fingers tightened further. Somewhere near the bar, Grant finally looked up from his conversation. He squinted toward the stage, confused. Still, no one stopped it. And Evan stood still, blinking slowly under the lights, heart racing, hands shaking, while the room continued to laugh. The room swelled with laughter, loud, layered, and oblivious. It bounced off the marble walls and crystal chandeliers, echoing like a celebration of its own volume. To anyone watching, the moment seemed harmless. Just a bit of fun. Just kids being silly. Just a quiet boy standing on stage with a microphone, too nervous to speak. Josie knew better. She was 3 steps into the main hallway with a tray of fresh glasses balanced on her forearm when the wave of laughter shifted, took on an edge. She didn't hear words, not clearly, but she heard the pitch change. She didn't need the details. The way the sound turned, sharper, more chaotic, was enough. Her eyes flicked across the room, past the golden streamers and the flickering candles, toward the stage. And there he was. Evan. Standing under the hot spotlight, small and rigid, with his fingers clenched around the microphone and his body unmoving. His shoulders were tucked in, almost like he was trying to fold into himself. Josie's feet stopped moving. She didn't rush forward. She didn't cry out or plead with the host to turn off the music. The tray stayed in her hands, still level, but her whole body had gone still. She stood there, silent, planted in the middle of the floor, an invisible figure in a black uniform among a sea of glitter and silk. And then gently, almost imperceptibly, she lowered the tray to a nearby side table. No one noticed. The guests were too busy laughing. Someone clapped at a table near the front. A child shouted something from the edge of the dance floor. Even the manager, standing off to the side, smiled awkwardly as if unsure whether to step in or let the moment continue. But Josie didn't move toward the stage. She didn't storm through the tables or throw up her hands in protest. Instead, she did something quieter. She took 1 step forward, into the open space between the guests and the stage, and placed her right hand gently over her chest, right above her heart. Her eyes never left Evan. She didn't blink. She didn't smile. She just stood there. Still. Present. And something in the air shifted. It didn't stop the music. It didn't silence the laughter. But in that moment, a connection formed that no one else in the room could see. Evan looked up. His gaze, which had been drifting somewhere near the back wall, finally found something steady. He saw her, not as a blur in a crowd, not as another adult pretending not to watch, but as a fixed point. His brow softened slightly. His breath, though shallow, seemed to settle for a beat. And then, with the microphone still trembling in his hands, Evan's lips moved. It wasn't speech, not yet. There was no sound. But his mouth formed shapes, tentative and uncertain. She. He didn't finish it. His voice caught in his throat. But Josie saw it. She read the movement. She didn't respond aloud. She didn't nod. But her fingers pressed just a little firmer against her chest, just enough to say, "I see you." Still, no one else noticed. The parents were distracted by their children tugging at sleeves. The servers passed between tables, collecting glasses and smiling politely. Even Grant, Evan's father, had turned back toward the senator mid-laugh, unaware that his son was about to break through a silence he'd held for 10 long years. Only Josie remained. Still. Like a lighthouse on a foggy coast, offering no sound, no instruction, only presence. And for Evan, that was enough. Because in that storm of confusion and spotlight and cruel giggles, someone stood still for him. Not to fix the moment. Not to defend him. But to say, without saying anything at all, "You are not alone in this room." The microphone trembled slightly in Evan's hands, its silver mesh head catching the glow of the overhead spotlight. He stood there like a statue, Still small, still shaking, still alone. The cartoonish background music played on, its mockery bouncing through the room. The laughter swelled again, as if the silence from Evan only added to the humor for those who didn't understand what silence could mean. A man near the back chuckled louder, nudging his wife with a smirk. A group of teenage boys whispered something and snickered. Even Grant, having only just started turning back toward the stage, hadn't yet grasped what was happening. And then, Evan moved. It was a small motion, almost imperceptible at first. His fingers adjusted on the microphone, not just clutching it now, but deliberately holding it. His left hand steadied it, and his right index finger twitched slightly as if his body was preparing for something he had never done before. Another wave of laughter broke out, louder this time. A young girl gasped in amusement, clasping her hands as if waiting for a joke. The crowd was primed to be entertained, primed to see this silent boy falter or fidget in some adorably awkward way. But Evan didn't perform. He raised his head, slowly, and his eyes, which had darted in all directions just moments ago, settled again. Not on the crowd. Not on his father. On her. Josie stood motionless in the center of the room, hands still resting over her heart, eyes never leaving his. And Evan raised his arm. There was no hesitation. He pointed, directly, clearly, toward Josie. The laughter started to falter, uncertain. People turned their heads, following the invisible line of his finger. What was this? Was he pointing at a waitress? Some guests murmured. A few chuckles hung awkwardly in the air. The music played on, unaware of the shift. And then Evan spoke. His voice was small, unsteady, raw, but clear. She never laughed at me. 6 words. 6 soft, halting words. The room went silent. Not quiet, silent. As if every fork mid-air, every breath half-taken, every blink had been paused by something sacred. The music cut abruptly. Someone near the soundboard fumbled for the controls, unsure what to do. But no one looked at him anymore. They looked at Josie. And then back at Evan. She never laughed at me. His voice didn't rise for emphasis. It didn't crack with emotion. It simply existed. A sound the boy had never given a room full of people before, a gift he had never offered a crowd. Grant froze where he stood, brows furrowed, lips parted. For a man who had spent a lifetime in boardrooms, on podiums, delivering keynote addresses and interviews to national news, this quiet declaration from his own son, was louder than anything he had ever heard. Evan's hand dropped from the mic. His breathing was shallow, but no longer panicked. He didn't look around for approval. He didn't smile or cry. He just stood there, having said the only thing that needed to be said. And no one, not one soul, dared to laugh now. The silence that followed Evan's words was unlike anything the room had ever known. It was not the silence of awkwardness or confusion. It was the silence of realization, heavy, still, and utterly complete. Like the room had been struck in the chest and was holding its collective breath. A child near the cake table, no older than 6, suddenly began to cry. Not a tantrum or a wail, just a slow, stuttering sob, as if her heart had understood something her mind hadn't yet named. Her mother, startled, reached for her glass of wine but paused mid-sip. Her hand hovered, then lowered. She set the glass gently on the tablecloth, as though afraid even that sound might shatter the moment. One of the teenage boys who had pulled Evan onto the stage, blazer crisp, hair too neat, shifted from foot to foot. His face, once smug with mischief, had gone pale. He looked at the others, searching for a cue, a way to laugh it off. But there were no more cues. No one met his eyes. He turned slowly and stepped down from the stage, his shoes tapping against the polished floor in quiet retreat. No one stopped him. No one applauded. The spotlight had moved, unintentionally, undeniably, away from them. Grant Willis didn't move. He stood frozen, halfway between the dessert table and the private dining alcove, where moments earlier he had been discussing a real estate deal worth 8 figures. His expression didn't change. Not immediately. But something behind his eyes flickered. His jaw tightened. His lips parted. But no words came. The sound of his son's voice, the 6 fragile words, still hung in the air, more deafening than any speech he had ever delivered from a podium. And it hadn't been for him. It hadn't even been about him. Evan had spoken, for someone else. And it broke something open in Grant. Something old. Something he didn't yet understand. Back on the stage, Evan was still standing. The microphone no longer shook in his hand. His fingers relaxed as he slowly, deliberately, set it back into the stand. He didn't look at the audience. He didn't seek praise or approval. His eyes had already moved on. To her. Josie still stood where she had been, center floor, hand over her heart, breath caught between disbelief and grace. And Evan stepped down. 1 foot after the other. Small, careful, steady. No one moved. Not the waiters lining the back wall. Not the guests seated at their tables, napkins bunched in their laps, hands suddenly unsure of what to do. Not the birthday family, whose expensive centerpiece now seemed absurd under the weight of that moment. Evan walked past them all. Past the decorations. Past the cameras. Past the father who had not known how to protect him. And he kept walking until he reached Josie. The only person who had seen him before he said a single word. And still, no one dared to move. Grant watched as his son reached Josie and stood beside her, still silent, still fragile, but now rooted in something no one else in the room could name. For a long moment, Grant remained frozen in place, as if stepping forward meant admitting he had missed something important, something he should have seen long ago. Then, slowly, he moved. He crossed the polished floor with steps that didn't carry their usual confidence. The quiet murmur of stunned guests faded behind him, replaced by the heavy rhythm of his own breath. His hands were at his sides, open, empty. He wasn't holding a phone or a drink or the usual shield of business talk. For once, Grant Willis wasn't a man walking into a room to control it. He stopped a few feet from Josie. She looked up at him, her hand still over her chest, as if to remind herself to stay grounded. Evan remained beside her, not touching her, but leaning ever so slightly in her direction, a compass finding north. Grant's voice came low, rough with something he hadn't had to speak through in years. "Did you teach him that?" he asked. Josie didn't respond right away. She glanced down at Evan, who now looked up at her as if waiting for her answer too. Then she returned her gaze to Grant and answered simply, with no apology, no performance. "No," she said. "I just didn't do what everyone else did. I didn't treat him like entertainment." The words landed sharper than they sounded. Grant blinked. His mouth opened, then closed again. Something behind his eyes shifted, a veil lifted, a realization blooming not with drama but with quiet clarity. He had been there. Present. Physically. At every appointment, every consultation, every carefully orchestrated playdate. He had written checks, built ramps, sponsored research centers. But never once had he asked Evan what he saw. Never once had he wondered what Evan needed to feel safe. He had measured care by action. But Josie had offered something else entirely, presence. Not the kind that fills a room, but the kind that makes space within it. The kind that doesn't speak over, doesn't fix, doesn't rush. The kind that simply waits, so someone else might emerge. Grant looked down at his son, who still hadn't said another word but stood taller than he ever had before. Not because someone had lifted him, but because someone had stopped long enough to let him rise on his own. For the first time in Grant Willis's life, he felt small. Not in shame. Not in defeat. In awe. He nodded, but it came with no certainty, no resolution. Only surrender. The kind that says, "I see now." And then quietly, he lowered his head. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't meant for the room. It was the slow bow of a man who had just been rescued from a lifetime of seeing himself as the savior. The launch event was modest. No celebrity appearances, no press wall, no gourmet catering. Just folding chairs, soft light from classroom windows, and a chalkboard at the front of the room. The kind of space where real things happened: parent-teacher conferences, support group meetings, teacher training on rainy afternoons. But the people who gathered that evening knew something significant was unfolding. At the front of the room stood a hand-painted sign with 4 words in bold: "Don't laugh first." Beneath it, in smaller letters, "Respecting presence in every child." It wasn't a foundation or a non-profit with glossy brochures. It was a promise, born out of a moment no one had expected, and few could forget. Grant Willis stood beside Josie, neither of them dressed in anything formal. Grant wore a sweater over a button-down shirt, the sleeves casually rolled. Josie had pulled her hair back in a simple clip. There was no script, no podium. Just shared purpose. He cleared his throat as the room quieted. "When we started this," Grant began, "it wasn't because we had answers. It was because we had missed something. Something my son showed us, not with words, but with silence. With stillness." People listened: educators, restaurant managers, parents, a few teenagers in the back row who'd come out of curiosity but now leaned forward, hooked. Josie stepped in beside him. "We're not here to shame anyone," she said. "We're here to ask a question. What if the quietest child in the room isn't lost, but waiting for someone to stay long enough to see them?" There was a beat of stillness. Heads nodded. Hands stilled. And then, Evan stepped forward. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He moved slowly to the chalkboard, where a single line had been drawn across the center. Beneath it, someone had left a piece of white chalk on the ledge. He picked it up, paused, then looked out at the room. 100 eyes watched him. He didn't flinch. Instead, he pointed. Not to the adults. Not to his father or to Josie. To a single word that had been written in childlike, slanted handwriting, just beneath the line. "Seen." His finger held steady. And no one said a thing. The silence wasn't awkward this time. It wasn't confused or shocked. It was reverent. People held their breath not because they didn't know what to say, but because they finally understood they didn't need to say anything. For the first time, Evan's presence didn't demand attention. It commanded respect. Sometimes, the most important person in the room is the one we almost missed. In a world that celebrates volume, speed, and sharpness, it's easy to forget the quiet ones, the people who sit on the edges of rooms, who speak less, feel more, and often go unseen. Evan's story reminds us that presence doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. It just has to be real. For older adults, those who've lived long enough to know the weight of silence, this message carries special meaning. Many of us have known what it's like to be spoken over, to be laughed at instead of listened to, or worse, to be invisible. Evan didn't speak often. But when he did, his 6 words stopped a room full of people in their tracks. Not because he shouted, but because he had nothing to prove, only something to reveal: the dignity of being seen without being judged. This is the kind of presence we can offer each other. Maybe it's a grandchild who doesn't respond the way other kids do. Maybe it's a neighbor who never joins the block parties. Maybe it's you, feeling a little more faded as the years go on, unsure if your voice still matters in rooms that move too fast. Here's the truth: you matter when you choose to notice, to sit still, to listen without rushing to fix, to witness, not to perform. Josie didn't teach Evan to speak. She simply didn't laugh. She didn't look away. And in doing so, she offered him something most people never do: the freedom to exist without expectation. You don't have to start a movement or launch a non-profit. You don't have to say the perfect thing. You just have to stay. Gently. Attentively. Without trying to fill the silence. Because sometimes, just being the person who doesn't laugh, who doesn't turn away, is enough to change someone's life. And in doing so, you might find that it changes yours too. If you've ever believed that staying silent meant you did no harm, remember, sometimes, the one person who didn't laugh was the only one brave enough to be pointed at. Like and subscribe, and share with us. Have you ever been truly seen in a room that had forgotten you were there?